Hello, and welcome to the Iron John podcast. At the recent 40th anniversary Minnesota Men's Conference, we revisited the story that started it all, the Grimm's tale, Iron John. Walton, Stanley, and Ben Dennis carried the tale this time, and just as it was 40 years ago, the story continues to bring a message about the tempering of the male soul. So, please enjoy Iron John. So I thought I would start the story with a poem in a new poetry book called Memories Honey Cloud that I just received from my good friend Timothy Young over here. This is called The Soul Knows. The soul has ways which we ignore most of the time. We focus on time itself. We know that the conductor keeps time so that the orchestra plays in time and the punctual patron arrives on time while the gasping latecomer enters just in time. Over time, we all need to learn that the soul moves in its own time. That's why a good storyteller takes his time to learn a story and tells it time after time, until he pays no attention to the times he tells it differently. Mm-hmm. At times, we realize that after a time, as time flies, a certain time comes and we've run out of time. The soul knows that before time began, there was once upon a time. So once upon a time, in a time that is not our time, in that time there were people that faced life with courage, and there were others that gave in to their fears. In that time, leaders sometimes made proclamations and edicts, and sometimes they didn't appreciate unforeseen consequences that might arise from their words and their actions. In that time, once upon a time, there was a king. Now this king had a castle. He kept court at a great castle, and this castle was near a deep forest. And there was much game in the forest. And it fell out that one day the king ordered one of his huntsmen to go into the forest and harvest a deer so that they might have venison for the royal table. The huntsman went into the forest at first light. But that huntsman didn't return. The king naturally assumed that something must have happened. So he called two more huntsmen to go in and find the one that was lost. Those huntsmen went into the forest as well, but they also never came back. Now, fearing something was really wrong, the king called all his huntsmen and foresters together, and he sent them in to find those three missing men. And none of them ever returned. Not even their dogs came back. And after that, the king gave orders that no one was to go into the forest again. The forest was off limits. It remained a dark and foreboding place. And the only thing people could see in there was occasionally a hawk or an eagle turning slow circles over the trees. That's how that was. And it might have remained that way. But one day, another huntsman showed up at the court. And he asked the king's permission to go hunt in that forest because it looked to him a likely place to find game. And the king refused. He said, "We don't go in there. People that go in there get lost. They don't come out." And the huntsman said, "Well, I'm fairly confident in my abilities, and I'll take my chances in the forest." And so the king agreed. And the huntsman the next morning went into that forest, took his dog with him, and it wasn't long before that dog picked up a scent trail. And the hunter followed that dog. He followed him until the dog came to a pond. And the dog was sniffing around the edge of the pond as the hunter came up. The dog working the edge of the pond, trying to find that scent trail where it had gone. And while the hunter was watching, a large, naked, hairy arm reached up out of that pond, grabbed the dog, and pulled it down under the water. What the huntsman did then is he went back to the king's court, and he got a group of men with buckets, and he took them all back to the pond, and they started to bucket out that pond, remove all the water, drain that little bog. And when they had drained all the water, they found sitting down in that depression, in that hole, in the bottom of that pond, a large wild man who was covered in red, rust-colored hair. They seized the wild man, they tied him up with ropes, and they hauled him back to the court of the king. All the people of the court gawked at the wild man, and the king gave orders that the wild man be put into a cage in the center of the court, that the cage be locked, and that it not be opened by anyone under penalty of death. And he gave the key to his wife, the queen, for safekeeping.
The king and the queen had a boy, 8 years old. We know what 8-year-olds are like. And this little 8-year-old was bright, rambunctious, playful. And he liked nothing more in life than to play with his golden ball that his father had given him. He'd roll it this way and that, bounce it off the walls, and play in the courtyard. And so it went that one day, this boy, playing with his ball, figured out how to give it a good kick and bounce it off that side wall of the courtyard. And as he did so, he gave a big swing with his foot and hit that ball. It bounced all the way back towards the back of the courtyard, where there was a cage. And right through those iron bars, that golden ball rolled until it stopped at the foot of that wild, rust-colored man. You can imagine the consternation of that little boy. He crept up to that cage, looked in through the bars and could see his golden ball shining. And he looked up and saw this fierce visage glaring back at him, not moving one bit. And after a time, see, he really wanted that ball. I mean, that was his favorite ball. And after a time, he screwed up his courage and he said, "Can I have my ball?" And that wild, hairy man looked down at him and said, "If you let me out of this cage, I'll give you the ball." And the boy took 2 steps back, said, "I can't do that. My father, the king, would never allow it." And he crept back and away and went back to his room and lay under his covers and wept. The next day, he went back out and he stood in the courtyard and watched that cage and watched that wild man in there who didn't move. And he could see his golden ball still at his feet. And so he snuck a little closer until he was at the edge of the cage and he called in, "May I please have my ball?" And the wild man looked at him, tipped his head down and looked at him and said, "Open the door of the cage." And the boy stepped back, shook his head no, and went back to his rooms once again, utterly terrified. The third day, he screwed up his courage, straightened his shoulders, and he marched up to that door and he said, "May I please have the ball?" And the wild man looked down at him and said, "If you open the door." And the boy said, "I can't, it's locked." And the wild man said, "The key? It's under your mother's pillow. If you have some courage, you can go get it." The boy really wanted that ball, so he turned around and began marching towards the castle, knees shaking a little bit, walked into the door, went up to his mother's chamber, looked this way and looked that way. Nobody was around. His father was off hunting. His mother was with the women of court. Snuck into her bedchambers, went to the pillow, pulled it off, and there underneath the pillow was an iron key, big as his forearm. Grabbed that, stuck it under his cloak so no one would see, and crawled back out of the mother's chambers and went back to the courtyard, made his way back across and went up to the cage, stuck that mighty key inside the lock and began to turn, and it wouldn't turn. And so he gave a little more of a twist. It still wouldn't turn. The wild man didn't say anything, just looked on. Until finally he got his arms all the way around. It twisted, open, unlocked, and in that process he pinched his finger, something fierce, and he let out a yelp. And as he was holding his finger, the wild man stood up, opened the door, and began striding out of that courtyard. And as he did so, the boy looked up, seeing the back of that wild, hairy man leaving him, cried out in fear and said, "Wait! If you leave me here, they will punish me." The wild man stopped, turned back to the boy, and without saying a word, picked him up, put him on his shoulder, walked out of the courtyard, made his way to the forest, and into the darkness he went. Later that day, the king returned from his hunt. The queen returned from entertaining the ladies of court. And as they met, they looked out across the courtyard. They noticed something. The cage door was open. The king went rushing down, looked this way and that, let out a roar, called for the queen. She came down and looked. The wild man was gone. The queen, realizing that something terrible had happened, went rushing back to her chambers, back to her bedroom, and saw there that the pillow was no longer where it belonged, and underneath should have been the key. That space was empty. And she stopped and she thought for a second. And as she thought, she realized, she put the pieces together, she realized something. and her eyeballs flew open, and she went rushing back down to the courtyard, went to the king, and said, "Where is our son?" And the king began looking here and there, called all of his guards together to look for their son, and they looked everywhere. And it went on for a whole day and a whole night. And as they realized what had happened, grief fell over that royal household. The wild man strode into the darkness of the forest for a long time, until he reached a place. Through the trees they could see a shimmering of pool, and he stopped. He took the boy off of his shoulder and set him down, looked at him, and said, "You will never see your mother and father again. However, I will take care of you. You took care of me in my hour of need, and I have some compassion for you. If you follow my instructions and you do what I tell you, your life here will be good. For I have much wealth and greater power than you can imagine." And with that, the wild man reached into the forest and brought out moss and soft duff, and he created a bed for the boy. Lay him down on that soft spot and let him go to sleep. So the boy lay on that moss, looking up into the branches, until he fell asleep. And in the morning when he woke, there was that wild man sitting beside him, waiting for his eyes to open. And when they opened, the wild man said to him, "I will take care of you. I have much wealth. I have much power. But you must do as I say. And today I'm going to take you somewhere." He stood and led the boy into the woods a little ways, not far, but a little ways, and there was a shimmering pool, a spring, golden. The light reflected off and around all the trees that were near, and the pool was absolutely mirror smooth. And the wild man said to the boy, "You're to sit here and watch that nothing that doesn't belong falls into this pool." And so the boy sat, the wild man left, and the boy sat there and watched that pool, the shimmering gold, the light reflecting. And occasionally, deep inside, he could see a golden fish or a golden snake swimming around deep underneath. And the day went on, the sun grew high. And as it did, the boy's finger began to ache. That wound, that soreness, it began to permeate his thinking, until one moment, without even realizing what he had done, he had put his finger into the pool. And as soon as he felt that coolness, he realized what he had done, pulled it out, and his finger was covered in gold. And no matter what he did to rub that gold off, it would not come off. And fear grew inside of the boy, realizing that he had done something egregious, something wrong. And at the end of the day, he could hear the wild man coming, and so he put his hand behind his back. And when the wild man entered, he looked at the boy and he said, "Has anything fallen into the pool?" And the boy looked at him and shook his head and said, "No. And the wild man said, "Show me your finger." See, he knew. And so the boy, we know that feeling of having to bring out the finger. And there it was, shining gold. And the wild man stood there in silence for a moment. "I'll let it pass this time. But if it happens again, the pool will be wronged." And with that, he sent the boy back to his moss bed to rest. And the boy had many strange dreams that we know nothing about, but maybe we remember our dreams. Because in the morning he woke, and the wild man was there once again waiting for him, and led him to the edge of that pool and sat him down, and without saying a word, left. And the boy, utterly determined not to let anything fall into that pool, stood stock still, would not even wiggle the fingers of his hand. And as he sat there and the day grew long, his finger began to throb. Until finally, he had to do something. He stretched his hand out like this, nowhere near the pool. And he ran his hand through his hair. Unfortunately, one hair came loose, and he watched as it drifted down towards the pool, and before he could reach it, it touched the water. And reaching in and snatching that hair out, it was not in time, for that hair had turned completely gold. Tucking it into his pocket, he sat back, really worried this time. And at the end of the day, the wild man came back, walked into the clearing, walked up to the young man, and said to him, for he knew, "What has fallen into the pool?" And the boy showed him the golden hair, and the wild man said, "I'll let it go this time, but nothing like this can happen again, or you will dishonor the pool." And so the boy one more time went to sleep in that moss bed, and in the morning he woke. And the wild man led him to the edge of the pool, and he sat there this time completely determined that under no circumstances anything was going to fall that shouldn't fall. And as he sat there, the magic of this place began to reach inside of him, until finally he caught a glimmer, a reflection in the top of that pool. And he leaned a little bit further forward. And as he did, he could see the trees above reflecting in the shininess of that pool. And he leaned a little bit further, and he could see the top of his head. And a little bit further, he began to see his eyes, and something deep inside of him desired to look deeply into his own eyes. And so he looked down into the pool straight in. And as he did, he caught the glimpse of his own true eyes looking back at him as his hair fell over his forehead and into the water. And leaping back, pulling his hair out as fast as he could, it was not in time, for his entire head of long hair had turned shiny, bright, shimmering gold. And the shame was so deep in him, he reached in and he took out his kerchief and he wrapped it around his head, hoping beyond hope that the wild man would not see it. The end of the day came. The wild man once again arrived as he had before. And he looked at the boy and he said, "Take off your kerchief." The boy reached behind his head, untied the kerchief, and his golden, shimmering hair fell down around his shoulders. And the wild man said to him, You have not passed the trial. You have not succeeded in the test. You can no longer stay here with me. You must go out into the world, and you must experience and learn about poverty. And in the morning, I will take you to the edge. One last night in that moss bed, and in the morning the wild man came to collect him. This time, however, the wild man strode ahead, and the boy followed as best as he could. And at the edge of the forest, the wild man turned to the boy and he said, I'll not leave you without something, for I do not see in you anything of evil. Your heart is good. And so I'll give you this gift. If you ever have need of me, real need of me, call out these words, Iron John! Iron John! Iron John! 3 times. And I will come. And I will help you. For I have more power than you can imagine. And with that, he turned and went back into the wood. And the boy made his way out into the world. And he walked for a long time, short time, searching for something to do. But there was nowhere that he could make his way. Until finally, in the distance, he could see a great city. And he began making his way that direction.
Well, the boy arrived at the city, and he set about looking for work. But the problem was he had no marketable skills. And after a time of looking for work, he made his way to the great palace of the king of that city. For having been raised in a palace life was something he knew about. And when he was at the palace, he asked if there was something he could do, some position he could fill. But they really had no openings. However, there was something about the boy that the people liked. The boy in the big hat, covering all his hair. And so they let him hang around for a time, and eventually it fell out that they gave him the position of assisting the cook in the palace kitchens. His job was to haul wood and to carry water and to rake the ashes out of the great hearths that they used to cook the food. And so that became his life, carrying wood, chopping vegetables, raking the ashes when the cooking was done. How many of you have ever worked in food service? That might have been his lot for the rest of his life. Who knows how many years he worked in that kitchen? But one day, it fell out that the cook was short-handed, and he needed someone to carry the food up to the royal table for the royal family, and he gave this job to the boy. The boy carried the food up to the great banquet hall, and when he entered and presented the food, he was wearing his hat. And the king saw this and said, "Young man, it is not appropriate that you leave your hat on in the presence of the royal family." And the boy said, "Pardon, Your Majesty, but you see, I have a nasty scab that's kind of oozing on my scalp, and I thought it better to leave the hat on." And the king did not like that answer very much. And he called for the cook to be brought before him, and he said, "What do you mean, hiring people like this to cook our food? Dismiss him immediately. Get rid of him. And so the cook had no choice. But the cook felt sorry for the boy. And so, instead of dismissing him out of hand, he made a deal to trade the boy with the gardener's boy. They swapped. And so now, the boy began working in the garden instead of in the kitchen. He began working in the earth, digging and hoeing and weeding, spending his days outside in the wind and weather, sleeping in the potting shed. That was how he lived. He spent who knows how much time doing that job, how many years. But one day in the summer, it was very hot out while he was working in the garden. And he took off his hat for a moment to wipe the sweat from his brow and from his hair. And that golden hair started to reflect in the sunlight. And golden reflections happened to fall right into the window of the king's daughter. And she saw a reflection of gold dancing on her walls. And it drew her attention. And she went to her window, and she saw the young man with magnificent, shining golden hair cascading down his shoulders. And so shortly after this, she called to the gardener, and she said, "Have your boy bring me a bouquet of flowers." And so the gardener gave the boy these orders. And the young man went and collected wildflowers and made a bouquet of them and tied them in a ribbon. And he set off to deliver these to the princess. And the gardener saw this, and he said, "What do you mean, delivering these weeds to the princess? Go pick some decent flowers out of our garden. What do you think we grow these things for?" And the young man said, "No, she will like these better." And he took the bouquet to the princess. And as he entered the room with the bouquet, the princess said to him, "You should remove your hat when you are in my presence. You know that's the proper etiquette." And again, the boy shuffled his feet a bit and said, "Well, you know, I have a scab on my head and it's really ugly." And the princess reached over for the bouquet, and as she did, she also reached over and snatched the hat off his head. And the golden hair cascaded down over his shoulders. And he quickly took the hat back and put it back on. The princess gave him some gold coins, and he hurried out of the chamber. And he gave the gold coins to the children of the gardener to play with. And the next day, the princess requested another bouquet be brought by the gardener's boy. And he again gathered wildflowers, took her the bouquet. And once again, she tried to snatch the hat off his head. But this time he was ready for her, and he held it on and gave her the bouquet. He took the coins, and again he gave them to the gardener's children. This happened a third day, but again he held the hat on his head and didn't let her see the golden hair again. Now, it so happened that around this time, a foreign army began to assemble on the frontier of the kingdom, threatening to invade, to overrun the kingdom. And the kingdom mustered for war. And all the young men gathered together to go off to war to defend the kingdom. And the gardener's boy said to them, give me a horse, for I will go to war as well." And they said, "Well, We'll give you a horse. Once we leave, we'll leave a special horse for you in the stable.
And so they rode off to go to battle. And when they had all left and the dust had settled a little bit, the young man went to the stables, and there inside the stables in the back corner, he could see the face of a horse that had a bit of gray around the ears, and the teeth were out a little bit. And when he led that horse out into the courtyard, it did a little hippity-hoppity walk, for it was lame in one leg. But he mounted that horse anyway, and he made his strange little gated way out of the courtyard of that castle. And he went down the way, and instead of heading toward the battle, he went back to that dark forest. And when he arrived at that dark forest, he dismounted his hippity-hoppity strange horse there, and he called out. At the edge, he called out, "Iron John! Iron John! Iron John!" You feel that in your chest? And there at the edge of the forest, in a dark place where there was nothing before, stood the hairy man. Red hair, red skin, dark visage. And he looked at the young man and he said, "What can I do for you?" And the young man stood up clear and says, "It's time for me to go to war. I need a horse that will carry me into battle." And Iron John said to him and says, "I will give you a horse and more." And he turned and he went back into the forest. And in a very short time, out came a stable boy leading a mighty war horse that blew hard air breath out of his nostrils. And with him, he had armor. Armor fit to do battle, and the proper weapons. And behind that stable boy came a troop of warriors, of men in iron armor. So the boy donned the armor, took up the sword, put it in his scabbard, mounted that mighty war horse, and off they rode like a hurricane to the battle. And when they came over the hill, they looked down and they could see the battle being fought. And the king and his men were beleaguered. And it did not look like they would succeed in defending the kingdom. And the young man and his troop roared down into that battle and set into the opposing army with such ferocity that they turned and they ran. And that young man fought without mercy, and he chased down all of the opposing soldiers until none were left. And when that battle was won, he turned his horse, and his men followed, and rather than going back to the king, he went over the hill and into the distance and rode back to that dark forest. And when he arrived, he called out once again, "Iron John! Iron John! Iron John!" And his voice echoed into the forest. And once again, as before, where there was only darkness, there stood this great hairy man, Iron John. And he said to him, "What can I do for you?" And the boy said to him, "It's time that I go back to the kingdom. I would like very much to give you back this horse and this troop of men and get back from you my hippity-hoppity horse." And out of the forest comes the stable boy, leading this odd-looking horse with a funny gait. The boy dismounted, took off his armor, cleaned himself up a bit, mounted the strange little horse, turned his back on that forest, and rode back to the kingdom. Now the king, having seen this turn of fortune, returned back to the kingdom. And when he arrived at the castle, he went inside and his daughter was waiting for him. And she asked him how things went. And he said, the battle was won. And she said, congratulations, father, you've won the battle. You've defended the kingdom. And the king stood there and shoulders drooped just a little bit. And he said, it wasn't me. There was a strange knight that arrived with a troop of men. And had they not arrived, when they did, the battle might have been lost, as was the kingdom. And she said, but who is this strange knight? And he said, I do not know. And her thoughts, something about the way that he had talked about this knight, had her wonder. And so she went down to the garden. We don't know why. She went to the garden. And she asked the gardener, where is the garden boy that normally works here? And the gardener laughed. He said, that's silly boy. When all of the soldiers had left, he'd gone to the stable and he brought out a hippity-hoppity lame horse. And he disappeared. And not too long ago, he came back, and when he did, the soldiers were all waiting, and they saw him riding in that strange gaited horse, and they all began to laugh. Oh, ho, ho, moopy goop, where have you been on your hippity-hoppity little horse? You've been hiding underneath the lilac bush while the rest of us have been doing battle? And the boy smiled, and he said, well, I fought, and I fought very well, and had I not fought the way I did, maybe the war would have been lost. And the gardener laughed and just shook his head, silly boy. So the princess returns back to the castle and talks with her father, and they're wondering who this knight might be. And the father says, well, the only thing that I can think to do is have a festival. And maybe this night will come if you would offer to throw out a golden apple on each of the 3 days.
And so the festival was announced, and it was announced that the princess would throw a golden apple to the knights who would vie for it. And the young man heard of this. And on the day of the festival, he went back, took that old hobble horse back to the edge of the forest. And again, he called out, Iron John, Iron John, Iron John. And once again, Iron John appeared at the edge of the forest, covered in his long red hair. And he said, what can I do for you? And the young man said, I want to be the one that catches that golden apple. And Iron John said, consider it done. It's as good as in your hand already. And Iron John gave the young man a suit of red armor and a magnificent chestnut horse. And the young man rode that horse with the armor, with his helm down, into the crowd of all the knights, just as the princess was about to throw the apple. And as luck would have it, he was the one that caught the apple. And you might think that he would ride up and be celebrated and be feted, but instead he turned his horse and galloped off into the distance without saying a word. And the king said, that's very odd. Let's do this again tomorrow. See if we get a better result. And so it was announced that the festival and the contest would be repeated. And the next day, the young man, the gardener's boy, rode out again to the edge of the forest, and he called out again, Iron John, Iron John, Iron John. And once again, Iron John appeared at the edge of the forest, and he said, how can I be of help to you now? And the young man said, I need another horse and armor, and I want to catch that apple again today. Iron John said, consider it done. He gave him a suit of white armor and a white horse. And once again, the young man rode to the festival. And once again, when the apple was tossed, he was the one who caught it. And once again, he rode off without saying a word. And the king said, this is not going to happen again. We are going to do this tomorrow. And let me tell you something. I give orders to my men that whoever catches that apple, if he tries to ride off without coming to see me first, they will chase him. And if they can catch him, they will give him a blow, and they will use their swords to do it. And so the festival was announced. And once again, the young man rode out in the morning, out to the edge of the woods. And he called out, Iron John, Iron John, Iron John. And once again, Iron John appeared. Iron John said, what can I do for you now? And he said, I need another horse. I want to catch that apple another time. Iron John gave him a suit of black armor and a jet black horse. And he rode that horse into the crowd among all the knights. And once again, when the princess threw the apple, he was the one that caught it. And he wheeled the horse around. It began to gallop off, but the king's men went out in pursuit of him. And one of them got close enough to strike him and wound him with his sword, cut him in the thigh. And in order to get away, he had to give that horse the spurs, and the horse made a great leap. And when the horse leapt, the helmet fell off the young man, and his golden hair could be seen by the men that were chasing him. And they came and described this to the court. And later that day, the princess went to the gardener, and she inquired about the gardener's boy. And the gardener just shook his head and said, that crazy coot. He's been going to the festival every dang day. And last night he came home and he showed 3 golden apples to my children. And so the princess reported this to the king, and the gardener's boy was sent for. And the king said, are you the one that caught the apples? And the boy removed his hat, and the golden hair fell down around his shoulders, and the people were stunned at the beauty of it. And the young man said, yes, here they are. And not only that, I was the knight that saved the day, that won the battle for you, that defended this land. And the king said, who are you? Clearly, you are not a mere gardener's boy. And the young man said, no, I am a true aristocrat. I am the son of a great king, and I have wealth and gold aplenty. And the king said, well, I am in your debt, and anything that is in my power to grant, I will grant you. And the young man said, I think your daughter should be my wife. And the girl laughed and said, well, he doesn't beat around the bush, does he? And then she went over and planted a kiss on his cheek. And she said, I knew he was no gardener's boy. And so there was a great wedding and a celebration. And the young man's parents were invited to the wedding. And they were overjoyed to see that the son they had thought lost all those years was indeed alive and had prospered. And while that wedding feast was going on, suddenly the doors burst open and cornets sounded, trumpets blew, And a great baronial king and his entourage entered the hall, magnificent to see. And that strange king introduced himself. He said to the young man, "I am Iron John. And because of you, the enchantment that I was under, that put me in the form of the wild man, that enchantment is now broken, and you see me as I truly am. And I am indebted to you, so all I have is now yours." That's how it was. And you know, that night in the feasting hall, this whole story was recounted. And there was a moth that was drawn to the candlelight of the great chandeliers of the feasting hall. And as dawn broke, that moth flew out the upper window of the feasting hall into the sunlight. And the story might have remained with that moth, but a swallow came and plucked that moth out of the air. And that's why the story has many twists and turns like the flight of the swallow, because it was carried for many years by the swallow people. But one year it happened that there was a great windstorm, and a swallow's nest was shook, and an egg fell out, and it landed on the ground at the root of an oak tree, and it broke, and the story was washed into the ground and picked up by the roots of that oak. And the story made its way up into the acorns, and it made them especially sweet. And it stayed there, trapped in an acorn, for many, many centuries. But one year, a pig farmer let his pigs graze there, and they love eating the acorn mast, you know, the hogs. And that acorn, that story in the acorn made the pork very delicious. And one day, Robert Bly ate a pork chop from one of the descendants of those pigs. And the story went into him, and he told Ben and me, and now we've told you.